So, how will you react when your life is turned upside down? That's actually my dog. He's excited to hear me today. I actually had a literal upside down moment when I was about your age. When I was 23, I was selected to sail from Hobart to Sydney in the tall ships race. I sailed for 5 days in a youth crew on a yacht. Ended up in Sydney, and then two of my friends and I, two guys and I, hired a car to drive back to Adelaide. 24 hours later, I was in the Royal Adelaide Hospital spinal unit with a neck broken in 3 places. I'd been in a really bad car accident. The car had rolled over and over again. I'd actually woken up from being unconscious upside down, not able to move. all I could taste was dirt, and I could feel the metal just kind of all scratchy and jutting into me, and I woke up. And what I'm going to tell you in a minute is what was the first thing that came into my head. But before I do that, my question to you is, how do you think you would react? How will you respond, or how have you responded when bad stuff has happened? I think for Christians, there's 3 possibilities. We can ignore God and try and work it out ourselves, which is the kind of God's irrelevant approach. We can doubt God or curse God, which is the God's not trustworthy approach. Or we can trust God. We can call out to God, we can rely on God. So what happened to me, I had a whole lot of thoughts come into my head when I woke up, and really 3 main things. I guess they all happened at the same time, but 3 main things. The first was, wow, I've been in a car accident. That happens all the time. Why would I be exempt? Secondly, I thought, God is bigger than this, and I can trust him. And the third thing I thought was, God is here, God is with me, I can talk to him. And I started to pray. And I was praying aloud, and I must have prayed really loudly because a lady came over. She was the first car to stop at the side of the road when the accident happened. And she said, "Are you a Christian, dear?" And I said, "Yes." And she says, "Oh, so are we." And she and her husband are Christians from Adelaide, driving also across the Hay Plains. And I thought to ask her, I said, where are the boys? Are the boys all right? And she said, well, one of them's standing here next to me. He's just got a scratch under his chin, and the other one's unconscious, but he's breathing. And so because she'd said she was a Christian, I asked her, would she please go and pray for my friend who is injured? And then I thought to ask her, because I couldn't remember anything, nothing at all. I said, who was driving? And she said, you were, dear. That was a bit of a shock. I hadn't expected that. So she went off. And I think the thing that makes the difference as to how we react, I think there are 2 main things. There's what we already think about bad stuff happening, and there's what we already think about God. Now, I've grown up always believing that bad stuff happens to good people and bad people. We live in a crazy mixed up world. None of us are exempt. I know that the stories in the Bible teach me that. Jesus talks about a story of a tower falling on 18 people and killing them. And he asks the question, were those people who died any more sinful than anybody else? And he says, no, they weren't. Now, Paul is a good example. We know that he was stoned and left for dead. He says that he was beaten with rods at least 3 times, and apparently 5 times got 40 lashes. Now, you might say, oh yes, but he was suffering for his faith. That's different. But actually, he was in a number of transport accidents, in those days obviously known as shipwrecks. 3 shipwrecks, we are told, and one of those, he was at sea in a storm for 14 days and nights. A lot of bad stuff happened to Paul, but in his second letter to the church at Corinth, he says when those bad things happened, when those calamities happened, he was content for the sake of Jesus. He knew something about God that was bigger than all of that stuff. Now there's another story I love that's in Daniel. It's the story of the fiery furnace. I'm sure you know it. King Nebuchadnezzar sets up this 90-foot high gold statue, which in your speak is about 28 metres, I think. 90-foot high gold statue, and he says everybody has to bow down and worship this statue. And there's 3 God-fearing Jewish boys, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, who refuse to bow down and worship the statue. King Nebuchadnezzar is furious, and he stokes up the fiery furnace and he condemns them to death in the fiery furnace. And I love what they say to him. They say to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Our God is able to save us from the fiery furnace. But you know what? Even if he does not, we will not bow down to your statue or worship your gods." They knew something about God that was bigger than whether they lived or died. Now actually they were saved from the fiery furnace, if you know the story, but not everybody gets saved from death. In the early church, James, who was the fisherman brother of John, was killed with the sword very early on. Stephen was stoned to death and died. And of course, right now today, Christians are dying in Syria all the time for their faith. I haven't finished telling you about my car accident. When the ambulance arrived, the guys did a very good job of getting me out of the car. They put a metal brace around my neck. Actually, it was a very good thing that the car landed upside down, because I had what's called a hangman's fracture, which is where your C2 vertebrae is broken all the way through, and the spinal cord is just sitting there unsupported because the bones are completely broken. So I was upside down with my hair kind of jammed under the roof of the car. If the car had landed on its wheels, I would have gone like this because I was unconscious, and that would have killed me, or made me a quadriplegic. So I was actually very lucky. So they got me out of the car, put me in the ambulance, and I suddenly realised my brain was starting to work, and I said to the guys, "Look, you know, where's my friend, the one who's really injured?" And suddenly I thought of something. It hadn't occurred to me before then. And I said to the ambulance guy, I said, could my friend die? And then they told me the truth. He actually had died already. So I think at that point my heart broke. And every day for the next year, there was not a day I didn't cry. Every time I thought of that beautiful guy, his parents, his girlfriend who was waiting for him in Adelaide, the fact that I'd been driving that car, I cried every day for a year. So how did my reaction stack up at that point? Yes, I believed that bad stuff happened, but I had not expected that bad stuff. Yes, I believed that God was trustworthy, but I did not understand. And I can tell you, you know, when I was in the hospital and people came to me and said, "Oh, you must have got so close to God because of this thing that's happened," it really frustrated me, because nothing makes bad stuff okay. Bad stuff is just bad stuff. The essence of suffering is that it makes no sense. We live in a crazy, mixed up world, and when bad stuff happens, it isn't okay, it's just horrible. That's why it's so hurtful. And when Jesus died on the cross and he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" At that point, when he was being judged for our sin, he didn't understand. That's why it was so horrible, because suffering is when you don't understand. But God is still there. And what about being able to pray? When stuff happens, sometimes you just don't know what to pray. But I can tell you, when I was in that hospital, something very weird happened to me. I'm in the spinal unit. I'm crying every day. I'm as sad as all out. And yet, the presence of God was so powerful in my chest. It was a physical thing. It was like, it's really hard for me to describe this, but it was like there was a fire of joy burning inside my chest. And that sounds bizarre, but it's true. The presence of God was so powerfully with me, and it was his joyful presence in the midst of sadness, which is quite strange. So, how do you fireproof your faith? Yes, you need to know what you think about bad stuff happening, or to quote Forrest Gump, shit happens. Yes, you need to know about God and that he is bigger than everything, but you also need to know that God and know that his spirit is in you. And I think, how do you know God? You know his love. How do you know his love? You know that he did not spare his son, and you remember that you were forgiven for your sins. And how do you know that? I love the verse in Romans 8 that says, nothing can separate us from the love of God, neither death nor life, neither hardship or persecution or distress, it says calamity. None of those things can separate us from the love of God. And when did God love us? Not when we were incredibly deserving and had it all together, but he loved us when we were lost, when we were distressed, when we were completely messed up, when we were full of shame, when we were guilt-ridden, when we had failed. That's when he loves us. That's when he did love us. That's when he loves us now. And so, even in the saddest of times, you know that that loving God is with you and that his people are praying for you. And how do you fireproof your faith? How do you know that when bad stuff happens and your life turns upside down that you won't lose that faith? Primarily, it's not about you. It's not about you having a great faith. I actually think it's more about God and the fact that we have a very great and faithful God.